I sold my own father's land to pay for my daughter's college education in the United States. Before that, I became a widow. I raised that daughter alone for more than 10 years, working as a teacher, saving every rupee, giving up everything I had, including the land my father left me. I sold all of it to put my daughter on a plane to Miami and give her the life I never had. She went. She studied. She grew. She built a beautiful career. And when I, at 68 years old with 2 suitcases, crossed the world to live with her, I discovered something no mother should ever discover. My daughter was hiding me from her friends, not out of malice, out of shame. I didn't know how to speak English properly. I didn't know how to take the bus in Miami. I didn't know anyone. I was completely dependent on the daughter I had given everything to, and it was exactly that daughter who one day, while fixing her earrings in front of the mirror, said to me, without even looking me in the eyes, "Mom, there are going to be people here today. Maybe it's better if you stay in your room." I was standing there with my hands covered in flour, making roti for her, and I heard that. What happened next? What I discovered about my daughter, about myself, and about the real price of sacrifice is what I'm going to tell you now. My name is Kamala, and this is my story. She asked me to stay in my room when the friends came for dinner. It wasn't a gentle suggestion. It wasn't an apologetic request. It was an instruction, direct, cold, delivered while she adjusted her earrings in front of the mirror without even looking me in the eyes. "Mom, there are going to be people here today. Maybe it's better if you stay in your room." I stood frozen in the middle of the kitchen with my hands covered in flour because I was making rotis for her. For the daughter I had raised alone for the past 12 years after my husband died. The daughter for whom I had sold my father's land, the land that had fed 3 generations of my family, just to pay for her college in the United States. And she was asking me to hide myself as if I were something that needed to be stored away, out of sight. I am 68 years old. My name is Kamala, and this is the story I never thought I would have the courage to tell. I was born in a small town in the interior of Maharashtra. Daughter of a farmer, granddaughter of a farmer. I grew up understanding that land is not just land. It is identity. It is heritage. It is the family name engraved in the earth. My father didn't have much, but he had dignity, and he taught me that dignity is not borrowed and not sold, except that I sold it. I sold his land, sold the piece of ground he left for me and my children, and used that money to send my only daughter, Priya, to study engineering in Miami. Because I believed in her, because I believed she would be different, because I believed the sacrifice had meaning. When Suresh died, my husband, Priya's father, she was 18 years old, I was 56. Suddenly, I found myself alone in a house that had become too large, with a daughter who cried at night, and a future that no one had taught me how to plan. But I didn't stop. I never stopped. I worked as a primary school teacher for 32 years. I woke up before sunrise. I slept after everyone else had already gone to sleep. I did everything an Indian mother knows how to do. Cook, save, pray, and keep going. Always keep going. When Priya was accepted to the university in Miami, I cried for 3 days. I cried from joy, from pride, from fear. It was over 1,000 miles from Pune to Mumbai, but it was the other side of the world between our life and the life she was going to have. I didn't know English beyond a few phrases I learned from watching television. I had never left the state, but I signed the papers. I sold the land. I put my girl on a plane and stood watching until the plane disappeared into the sky. In the years that followed, Priya called frequently. then less frequently, then occasionally. In the beginning, she told me everything: the classmates, the classes, the city, the Miami heat that she said was different from the heat in India. Over time, the calls grew shorter. She was busy. I understood. She was building her life. I understood. She got a job, then a better job, then a beautiful apartment in Brickell. And in the photos she posted, I could see a woman different from the girl I had put on that plane. That's not a criticism. That's just the truth. She had become another person. Or perhaps she had become the person she always wanted to be, and that person didn't include much of the life we had lived together. I didn't complain. It wasn't my place to complain. Indian mothers don't complain. Indian mothers thank God that their daughter is well, that the daughter has a job, that the daughter is not going hungry. I gave thanks. Every day. Then, 3 years ago, Priya called me with a proposal. I was getting older. I lived alone. My sisters were worried about me, and she said, "Mom, come live with me. Miami is nice. You'll like it." I heard those words and felt something inside my chest that I hadn't felt in a long time. I felt that my daughter still needed me. I felt that the sacrifice had come back to find me in the form of a second chance. I came. I brought 2 suitcases. I brought my wedding sari folded at the bottom of the bag because my mother had told me never to throw it away. I brought the photo of Suresh. I brought my handwritten recipe notebook. I brought my medications for blood pressure and for my knee. And I brought hope. A lot of hope. Hope that didn't even fit in the suitcase. Priya's apartment was beautiful. Very beautiful. 15th floor. Window facing the bay, furniture I had never seen in my life. I stood in the doorway looking at all of it and thought, my daughter made it. Look at what she built. And I felt pride, an enormous pride, the kind that fills your eyes with tears before you understand what you're feeling. But something felt different from the very first day. It wasn't anything I could name right away. It was a collection of small things. The way she spoke about my room. "Mom, your room is here." Pointing to a small space at the back of the apartment, with a window facing the wall of the neighboring building, while her own room was enormous and had a view of the sea. I didn't complain. The room was clean. The room was sufficient. But I realized she had thought about this before I arrived. She had decided where I would stay. In the first days, I tried to help. I cooked. I cleaned. I did the things I knew how to do. But Priya came home from work tired, ate little, looked at her phone, and sometimes I would stay in the kitchen waiting for her to finish dinner, just to have someone to talk to for a few more minutes. She went to bed early. She woke up early. The apartment was silent in a way I didn't know apartments could be silent. I began to observe, not out of malice, out of loneliness. I had nowhere to go. I didn't know anyone in Miami. I didn't know how to take the bus. My English was too weak for real conversations. So I stayed in the apartment, cooked, cleaned, and observed. And what I observed was this. Priya had a parallel life that I was not part of. She had friends. Many friends. Americans, Brazilians, Indians raised in the United States, all speaking English fast, laughing at jokes I didn't understand, dressed in ways that in my hometown would have drawn attention. And when those friends came over, or when she went out to meet them, I simply did not exist. She didn't introduce me. She didn't mention me. I was something that was in the apartment, like the bookshelf or the washing machine. But that night, with flour on my hands and the request to stay in my room, was the first time the invisible became explicit. What I felt but tried not to feel was spoken aloud and became real. I went to my room. I sat on the edge of the bed with Suresh's photo in my hand and thought, if he were alive, would this be happening? If he were here, would our daughter ask me to hide myself? Or is this what happens to a mother who raises a child alone? You give everything, and in the end you become the thing they need to store away from others. On the other side of the door I could hear the laughter. I could hear the music. I could hear Priya speaking English in a voice I barely recognized. A lighter voice, a looser voice, a voice she didn't use with me. And I sat there, 68 years of life, 3 decades of sacrifice, 1 piece of land sold, and 1 husband buried, sitting in the back bedroom of a 15th floor apartment in Miami, waiting for the guests to leave so I could come out and get a glass of water from my kitchen. This is the story I am going to tell. Not to accuse my daughter, not to bring shame to the family, but because I know there are other mothers like me. Mothers who sold everything. Mothers who were left alone. Mothers who crossed oceans following hope and arrived on the other side to find that hope didn't know the right address. For those mothers, I am speaking. I learned to count the steps between my room and the kitchen. 23 steps. I knew exactly when Priya was sleeping, when she was awake, when it was safe to move around the apartment without my presence being an inconvenience. It wasn't a conscious decision at first. It was something my body learned on its own, the same way you learn not to touch a hot surface after burning yourself once. You don't think. You simply move away. The burn in my case was not physical. It was her silence when I entered a room where she was. It was the way she looked at her phone with more attention when I started to speak. It was the way she responded with single words. Yes, no, okay, without taking her eyes off the screen. Small things. Things that any outside observer might call exaggeration on my part. But when you are a mother, you know every layer of your child's silence. You know the difference between the silence of someone who is tired and the silence of someone who would prefer you weren't there. Priya's silence was of the second kind. I tried to adapt. That was the word I used with myself in those first months. Adapt. As if the problem was that I hadn't adapted yet. As if with a little more patience, a little more silence on my part, a little more shrinking, things would sort themselves out. I reduced the space I occupied. I cooked during the hours when she wasn't home. I watched television with the volume so low that sometimes I couldn't even hear it properly. I spoke less. I tried to be light, almost transparent, almost not there. But there is a limit to how much a person can shrink before disappearing completely. Priya's apartment was in a neighborhood called Brickell. I learned that name in the first days because she repeated it with a specific pride. Brickell is the best neighborhood in Miami, Mom. It's where the city's financial elite live. I listened and nodded without fully understanding what financial elite meant in the context of real life, but understanding her pride. The neighborhood was beautiful, that was true. Tall mirrored buildings, clean streets, shops with names I didn't know how to pronounce, well-dressed people walking quickly from one place to another. I observed all of this through the window of my room, which faced the wall of the neighboring building. But if I positioned myself at a certain angle, I could see a strip of sky and a piece of the street below. I made this into a ritual. In the mornings, after Priya left for work, I would stand looking through that sliver of world and think about my city in Maharashtra. I thought about the noise of the market in the morning, the smell of incense coming from the temples, the neighbors calling good morning to each other from one balcony to another. In Miami, nobody called good morning to anyone. Loneliness has a physical weight. That I discovered in Miami. In India, even during the most difficult periods after Suresh died, I was never truly alone. There were my sisters, there were the neighbors, there were my students at school, There was life all around that came through the window without asking permission. In Miami, the apartment was hermetically sealed. The air conditioning ran constantly, the windows rarely opened, and the world outside stayed on the other side of a thick glass that muffled every sound. It was like living inside a very expensive icebox. I began to cook more than necessary. Not out of wastefulness. I never wasted food. I was raised not to waste anything. But because cooking was the only thing I knew how to do that gave meaning to my hours. I made dal. I made rice. I made sabji. I made things that took time, things that required attention, things that filled the apartment with smell. And for a moment, while I cooked, I felt myself somewhere familiar. But Priya rarely ate what I made. She would come home from work and say she had already had dinner, or that she wasn't hungry, or that she was on a diet. Sometimes she would open the cupboard, take something pre-packaged, and eat standing in the kitchen while reading something on her phone, without sitting down, without looking at the full pot I had spent the afternoon making. I would sit at the table waiting, not waiting to be served. I would have served her, as I always had, waiting for company, waiting for her to sit down, waiting for a conversation that never came. One night I dared to ask. I said, "Priya, aren't you going to eat? I made your favorite dal, the way you liked it when you were little." She looked at the pot. Then she looked at me and said with a patience that had the shape of impatience, "Mom, I don't eat those things anymore. Too much sodium, too much fat. I'm trying to eat in a healthier way." I said nothing, but that sentence stayed inside me for many days. Those things. The dal I had learned to make from my mother, which my mother had learned from hers, which had crossed generations of women in my family carrying the smell of home, had become those things. Something she no longer ate. I began to understand that Miami was not just a different city. It was a different life. And the different life my daughter had built had no room for many of the things I represented. There was a scene that repeated itself with variations. Priya had a group of friends. I saw them in photos on her phone, which she sometimes left on the table. Young, beautiful women, smiling in restaurants, on beaches, at parties. Indian like her, but Indians of a different kind. Raised in the United States or who had come young and become completely Americanized. They used their Indian names with last names that sounded good in English, mixing the two cultures in a fluid way that I admired, but couldn't reach. And when those friends came to the apartment, the transformation in Priya was visible. She became more animated. Her voice rose in pitch. She laughed in a way I didn't hear when we were just the two of us. She moved through the apartment with a lightness that disappeared when I entered the room. And I would watch from the kitchen doorway, sometimes, before she saw me, and her face hardened slightly in that way she had of saying, without saying, "It's not the time for you to appear." One afternoon, one of the friends, a young woman named Divya, whose name I knew because Priya mentioned it often, arrived earlier than expected. Priya wasn't home yet, and I answered the door. Divya looked at me with that expression of gentle surprise people have when they encounter something they didn't expect, and said in English, "Oh, hi, is Priya home?" I replied in my broken English that she hadn't arrived yet, but she could come in and wait. Divya came in, sat on the sofa, and looked at her phone. I went to the kitchen and made tea. I brought 2 cups, the way it's done in India, with milk and cardamom. I placed them on the table in front of her. Divya looked at the tea with an expression I couldn't quite read, but said, "Thank you," and drank. And then she asked me, in English spoken more slowly, as if she knew I needed more time, "So, you are Priya's mom? She never mentioned you were here." She never mentioned you were here. 7 words. Divya didn't mean to hurt me. She was just saying what was true. But those 7 words told me everything I needed to know about the place I occupied in my daughter's life in Miami. I existed in the apartment, but I did not exist in her life. When Priya arrived and found Divya having tea with me in the living room, something passed across her face. It wasn't anger. It was something harder to name. A kind of discomfort, like when someone finds 2 parts of their own life they prefer to keep separate. She greeted me, greeted her friend, and with great skill redirected the conversation and both bodies toward her bedroom, closing the door. I stayed in the living room with the 2 cups of tea on the table. That night, after Divya left, I tried to talk to Priya. I said her friend was nice. She said yes. I said I had made tea for both of us. She said, "Thank you, Mom." And I gathered my courage and asked, trying to keep my voice calm, "You hadn't mentioned me to her?" Priya stopped, breathed and said, "Mom, it's not like that. I don't talk about my personal life to everyone." Personal life? I was her personal life. I was something she didn't talk about to everyone. I went to my room early that night. I wrote a letter to my sisters in Maharashtra. I still write by hand. I don't know how to use apps properly. And in the middle of the letter, I realized I was lying. I wrote that Miami was beautiful, that the apartment was comfortable, that Priya was well. I didn't write the truth because I didn't know how to write the truth without making it seem like I was destroying my daughter's reputation. And an Indian mother does not destroy her child's reputation, not even when the child destroys hers. I put the unfinished letter away and turned off the light. On the other side of the window that faced the neighboring building's wall, Miami kept being Miami. Loud, luminous, full of life that wasn't mine. And I lay in the dark thinking about how much longer I could do this. Stay invisible. Stay stored away. Stay on the outside of a life I had paid for with my father's land. There is one day I cannot forget. Not because it was the worst, but because it was the day I understood, with a clarity that hurts like too much light in the eyes, the exact size of the distance between me and my daughter. It was a Saturday morning. Priya was home, which was already unusual. She usually left early on weekends. Gym, brunch, commitments I didn't quite understand. But that occupied all the time that wasn't work. That Saturday she stayed home, and I woke up early as always, made tea, and felt a foolish hope that maybe we would spend the day together. Maybe talk. Maybe she would tell me something about her life. Maybe I would remember what it felt like to really be her mother. Not the apartment mother. Not the mother who stays in the room when guests come. I was in the kitchen when I heard her voice on the phone. She was speaking in English, animated. In that way I already knew, was reserved for friends. I didn't understand everything, but I understood enough. She was making plans for later, a lunch maybe, or an outing. I heard her say a name I didn't know, and then heard laughter, that light, carefree laughter she had, and that I could no longer draw out of her. When she walked into the kitchen and saw me, the laughter stopped, not dramatically, not with a slammed door or a sour expression. Priya was never overtly rude. I need to say that because it's true, and because her cruelty was never that kind. It was a soft cruelty, polished, that used politeness as distance. She came into the kitchen, picked up a piece of fruit, gave me a good morning in a voice still warmed by the phone call but already cooling, and said she was going out later with some friends. I asked very carefully, like someone walking on ground that might give way, "Can I come?" The silence that followed that question was the longest silence I have ever lived. It wasn't many seconds on the clock, but in the time that exists inside a mother's chest, it was years. Priya bit the fruit, looked to the side, and said, "Mom, it's a friend's thing. You wouldn't feel comfortable. Nobody speaks Hindi there." Nobody speaks Hindi there. I had learned Hindi before English, of course, but I knew a little English. Enough to buy bread at the corner bakery. Enough to understand television if they spoke slowly. Enough to have tea with Divya that afternoon. But it wasn't about the language. And I knew that. And she knew I knew. And yet we stayed there with that polished lie between us like a glass wall. Invisible, but impenetrable. "That's fine," I said. "I'll stay." And I stayed. I spent that entire Saturday alone in the apartment. I cleaned things that were already clean. I made food that sat in the pot. I tried to watch television but couldn't concentrate. I kept looking at my phone waiting for some message from my sisters in Maharashtra. But the time difference was large, and when it was late morning in Miami, it was deep night in Pune. And then I did something I had never done since I arrived. I went out. I went out without telling Priya, because she wasn't there to tell. I picked up my bag, put the apartment address on a folded piece of paper in my pocket so I wouldn't get lost, and took the elevator down to the street. Miami met me with a humid heat that was different from the heat of India. Heavier, saltier, with a smell of sea mixed with petrol. I stood for a moment on the sidewalk, looking in both directions like someone who doesn't know which way to go, because in fact, I didn't know which way to go. I started walking. I had no destination. I walked along the main road, stepped around people walking with earphones in and eyes fixed ahead, looked in the windows of shops selling things I would never buy. And then, on a corner, I found something I hadn't expected to find. A temple. Small, discreet, squeezed between two commercial buildings, with a sign in English and in Gujarati. It wasn't my language, but it was a language I understood enough of, and more than that, it was a temple. It was the smell of flowers and incense that reached me before I even stepped inside. I went in. Inside was an old woman, older than me, sweeping the floor. She looked at me, saw my sari, and spoke in Gujarati. I answered in Marathi. We looked at each other for a second and then both laughed, because it was funny, and at the same time completely natural. Two old Indian women, each with her own language, finding each other in a tiny temple in Miami, and understanding one another anyway. Her name was Savitaben. She had lived in Miami for 22 years. She had come with her husband, who had died 6 years ago. Her son lived in Houston, her daughter in London. She had stayed in Miami because the temple needed someone, and because, as she said with a calm that broke my heart, she had nowhere else to go that was truly home. We sat on a wooden bench inside the temple for almost 2 hours. We spoke little, actually. The language barrier was real, and neither of us spoke English well enough for a long conversation. But there is a language that needs no words, that Indian women of our generation know well. The shared silence of those who have been through the same thing. She knew what I was feeling without me needing to describe it. I knew what her life had cost without her needing to tell me. When I left the temple, I was different. Not resolved. Life doesn't resolve itself in 2 hours on a wooden bench, but less alone and less invisible. When I returned to the apartment, Priya had already come back. She was in the living room with her laptop and looked at me with an expression I didn't expect. Concern. "Mom, where were you? I sent you a message." I picked up my phone. There were 3 messages from her. The first asking where I was. The second with a question mark. the third saying to let her know I was all right. I said I had gone out for a walk. She frowned. Alone? Mom, you don't know Miami. You could have gotten lost. I said I had the address in my pocket. She kept looking at me for a moment, and I tried to read what was in that look. Was it genuine care? Was it inconvenience? Was it guilt? Perhaps all three things together, scrambled in a way that even she couldn't separate. Let me know next time, she said, and returned to the laptop. But something had changed that day. Not in her. In her, things changed very slowly, and I was learning that forcing change in Priya was like trying to bend wet bamboo. You get a little, but the bamboo always wants to go back to where it was. What changed was me. I had gone out. I had found Savitaben. I had remembered that I existed outside the walls of that apartment. I started going to the temple every week, on Tuesdays and Saturdays, when Priya was at work or with friends. I would go out, walk the 27 minutes to the corner where the temple stood, and spend a few hours with Savitaben and the other women who gradually began to appear. There was a community there that I didn't know existed. Women like me, mothers and grandmothers who had crossed oceans following their children, and who had arrived at the same loneliness with different addresses. We had tea. We prayed. Sometimes we cooked together in the small kitchen at the back of the temple, and the smell of spice took over everything, and for a moment Miami disappeared, and we were in any city in India, on any afternoon of our former lives. It was on one of those afternoons that one of the women, a lady from Rajasthan named Meenakshi, who was 72 years old and had a sharp tongue I envied, said something that stayed with me. The problem is not that our children have forgotten us. The problem is that they want us perfect and quiet at the same time. They want to be able to show us when it's convenient and store us away when it's not. Like the good china that only comes out for guests. The good china that only comes out for guests. I thought about that for days. And I thought about my own mother, who spent the last years of her life in my older brother's home, quiet in a corner, being served but not consulted, present but not included. And I had promised myself that when I grew old, when my turn came, I would not be treated that way. But the promises we make to ourselves when we are young don't know the future that is waiting. The crisis, when it came, didn't come dramatically. It came slowly, as most things that truly change life do. Priya had a work colleague, a man named Rajan, Indian too, raised in the United States, with whom she went out frequently. She never formally introduced him to me as a boyfriend, but I could tell from the late arrivals, from the way she sat on the phone smiling, from the weekends that disappeared entirely. I didn't ask. It wasn't my place to ask. But one day he came to the apartment. I was in the living room when he arrived, and this time there was no way to send me to my room, because he arrived suddenly, a knock at the door, and I answered because I was closer. He saw me, smiled with complete politeness, said, "Oh, you must be Auntie." The way young Indians raised abroad address older women, a respectful form of address that at the same time carries an enormous distance, and came in. Priya appeared from her room, saw the scene, and made introductions quickly and superficially. "Rajan, this is my mom. Mom, this is Rajan. We work together." Work together. Nothing more than that. Afterward, they went to Priya's room and closed the door. I stayed in the living room with the television on but muted, because I had learned not to make noise when she had company. And I thought, my daughter has an entire life happening behind closed doors, And I am the person who stays on the outside waiting for someone to remember to open them. That night I didn't sleep. I lay there looking at the ceiling of the small room and asked myself the question I had been avoiding since I arrived. Why did I come here? It wasn't anger. It was an honest question, the kind that appears at 3 in the morning when there is no more pretending that everything is fine. Why had I crossed the world to be stored in a back room? I had sold my father's land to give my daughter freedom, and her freedom included the freedom to ignore me. And then came another question, harder. What do I want? Not what Priya wants. Not what my sisters think I should want. Not what society expects of a 68-year-old Indian widow. What do I, Kamala, want for the time that remains to me? I had no answer that night, but it was the first time in many months that I had asked the question. And questions, I learned, are always the beginning of something. The conversation that changed everything happened on a Thursday afternoon, with rain outside, and the smell of petrichor coming through the one window Priya left slightly open when it rained. I was cooking. She arrived earlier than usual, which was itself unusual, and stood in the kitchen doorway watching me for a moment, before speaking. I felt her presence before I heard her. I was always that way with Priya. Since she was a baby, I could feel when she was in a room even without seeing her. It's something with no rational explanation. It's just being a mother. Mom, I need to talk to you. I lowered the flame, wiped my hands on the dish towel, and turned around. Her face was serious, but it wasn't the serious of anger. It was the serious of someone who has prepared what they're going to say and is afraid to say it. I recognized that expression. It was the same one she had at 17 when she told me she wanted to study outside India. The same mixture of determination and guilt. We sat at the table in the living room. The rain beat against the glass. She said that Rajan had asked her to move in with him, that they had been together for almost a year, that their apartment would be larger, in a different neighborhood, and that she was seriously thinking about accepting. And then she paused and looked at me with those eyes that are just like Suresh's. The same shape, the same dark brown, the same capacity to break me without meaning to, and said, I don't know what's going to happen with you, Mom. If I go, you'll be here alone. Or you'll need to go back to India. Or you'll need to go back to India. I was silent for a long moment. Not because I had nothing to say. I had many things to say. Years of things to say. But because I needed to choose the right words. I had spent months being careful with words, being small, being invisible. But something that afternoon, maybe the rain, maybe the smell of food, maybe simply the exhaustion of so much shrinking, told me it was time to stop being careful. So I spoke. I said, Priya, I need to tell you something I never told you because I didn't want to hurt you. But if I don't speak now, I will carry this until I die, and I don't want to die carrying it. She was quiet. I continued. I told her about the night of the rotis, about the back bedroom, about Divya, who didn't know I existed, about the Saturdays alone, about learning to count the steps between my room and the kitchen so as not to be an inconvenience, about the good china that only comes out for guests, about my father's land sold and the money used, and the hope I had brought in 2 suitcases, and that had been wilting slowly, so slowly I barely noticed when it was gone. I didn't cry. That surprised me. I had imagined this conversation so many times in the past months, and in my imagination I always cried. But in real life I spoke with a firm, low voice, as if telling someone else's story, because perhaps that was the only way I could tell it to the end. Priya grew quieter as I spoke. I saw the moment when the words began to truly land in her, not as an accusation, but as a mirror. She saw herself reflected in what I was describing, and what she saw was not the successful daughter from Brickell. It was a woman who had asked her own mother to hide herself. When I finished, the silence between us lasted a long time. Then she began to speak, and what she said was not what I expected. I expected defense. I expected explanation. I expected that cold politeness she used when she wanted to close a subject without resolving it. But what came was something else. She said, "I know, Mom." Just that, at first. "I know." 2 words that weighed tons. Then she opened up. She said that when I arrived, she was scared. Not of me, but of what I represented. I represented India. I represented expectations. I represented the life she had left behind with great effort and some pain. She had built a new identity in Miami, an identity that worked here, that her friends here understood, that her work here respected. And when I arrived with my saris and my dal and my Hindi, she felt as if the 2 versions of herself were about to collide, and she didn't know how to handle that except by keeping the 2 versions separate. She said, "I was ashamed, Mom, and I know that's wrong, and I know you didn't deserve that, but it's the truth." I looked at my daughter sitting before me, this 38-year-old woman I had raised with the hands that still knew how to make roti, and beneath all the armor of Miami, I saw the 18-year-old girl who had gotten on a plane to the other side of the world, carrying a fear she had never told me about. She had arrived in a country that didn't know her name properly, that didn't know her food, that didn't understand where she came from, and she had survived by learning to be another person. She survived so well that the other person took over. I didn't absolve her. That's not my role. And what she did, asking me to hide myself, treating me as invisible, not mentioning me to the people she loved, that was wrong. Full stop. There is no context that makes that stop being wrong. But I understood. And understanding is not the same as accepting. Understanding is just seeing the thing completely, without taking any piece away. We talked for 3 hours. The rain stopped, started again, stopped once more. The food on the stove went cold, and neither of us got up to reheat it. It was the longest conversation we had had since I arrived in Miami. Perhaps the longest we had had in years. By the end of that conversation, one thing was clear. I could not keep living there that way. Not because Priya was a bad daughter. She wasn't. She was a confused daughter, divided, afraid of things she herself couldn't name. But I had reached a point where my own dignity was at stake. And dignity is the one thing nobody can sell on your behalf. You only lose it if you hand it over yourself. I told her I wanted to go back to India. Not as defeat. I need to make that clear because it's easy to read that sentence as defeat. And it isn't. I wanted to go back because Miami was never mine. I had come on a hope that was real, but that was based on a version of Priya that existed more in my head than in reality. The real Priya was this complicated, frightened woman sitting before me, in the process of becoming someone. And that process didn't include space for me right now. Perhaps it never would. Perhaps one day it would. But I couldn't put my life on hold, waiting for a day that might never come. I was 68 years old. I had enough health. I had sisters in Maharashtra who sent messages asking how I was doing. I had a temple in the city where I grew up, where I knew every stone in the floor. I had a life that, though smaller and simpler than Priya's life in Brickell, was truly mine, recognizable, with my name engraved in it. Priya went silent when I said this. Then she began to cry. Not the contained crying she used when she wanted to seem composed. It was real crying, the kind that comes from deep down, that leaves your face red and your breathing irregular. She said she didn't want me to go, that she would change, that things could be different. I believed that she believed it, but I also knew, with the wisdom that only years teach, that changing is the hardest thing there is, that people truly change very rarely, and when they do, it's because they've reached their own limit, not because someone asked them to. Priya might change. I hoped she would change. But I couldn't keep waiting in a back bedroom with a view of a wall. I returned to India 43 days after that conversation. Priya drove me to the airport. We stood in the check-in line almost without speaking, not out of hostility, but out of that kind of emotional exhaustion that comes after everything has been said and nothing more needs to be said. She carried my large suitcase even as I told her I could manage it myself. When it was time for me to go through security, she hugged me. A long hug. Longer than she had hugged me in many years. And I smelled her hair and closed my eyes. And for a second we were the two people we had been before. Mother and daughter without complication, without Miami, without Brickell, without the weight of everything that had happened between the years. Just for a second, but the second was real. I said, "I love you. That doesn't change." And I meant it without condition and without demand, because it was true. A mother's love has no conditions. It exists even when it hurts. It exists even when the loved person disappoints us. It exists even when we need to leave to protect ourselves. Love is not the same as submission. It took me 68 years to truly learn that. I arrived back in Maharashtra on a March morning. My sisters were at the airport. The oldest, Sulochana, hugged me so hard I felt it in my bones. She didn't ask anything. She just stood there, hugging me in the middle of the airport, as if I had returned from a war. And from my perspective, I had returned from something like it. The house where I grew up was no longer mine. The land had been sold years ago, and I lived in a small apartment near my sister's. But when I opened the door to that apartment and entered and smelled the place, the specific smell that only exists in a place that is yours, I dropped my bag on the floor and stood in the middle of the room and breathed deeply for the first time in months. In the months that followed, I rebuilt. A word that sounds large, but that in practice is made of small things. Returning to the market in the morning, having tea with my sisters, praying at the temple I have known for 50 years, cooking for myself without worrying whether the smell would bother anyone. I returned to the sewing classes I had abandoned when Suresh died. I started teaching some of the neighbors' children to read, for free, because I was always a teacher and because I feel whole when I teach. Priya calls every week now, sometimes twice a week. The conversations are different, more honest, slower, like two people who have learned that they have to build a real bridge instead of pretending the distance doesn't exist. She and Rajan are living together. She seems happier, and I am glad about that, because a mother's love works that way. It wants good things for the child, even when the child has made mistakes, especially when the child has made mistakes. She apologized to me properly in a 1-hour call last month. A real apology, not the polished kind. She told me she had thought a great deal, that she had even spoken with a therapist about it. Something normal in her generation and unthinkable in mine. And that she understood she had treated me as a problem, to be managed, not as a person to be loved. She said, "I forgot that you are a person, Mom. I treated you like a role." I was silent for a moment. Then I said, "I know you know that now, and that matters." I didn't say that everything was fine. It wasn't all fine, and it never will be completely, because certain things that happen between a mother and child leave a mark, and the mark is part of the story, and the story is part of who we are. But I said it mattered, because it did. Today I am 69 years old. I have a knee that hurts when rain is coming, blood pressure that needs medication every day, hair that is completely white and that I stopped trying to hide a long time ago. I also have my sisters, the temple, the children I teach, my mother's recipe notebook that sits on the kitchen table because it is an object of use, not of display. I have a life that is truly mine, with my name in it, recognizable when I wake up in the morning. And I have this story, which I told because I know there are other women like me. Women who sold their father's land to send their children to study abroad. Women who became widows and kept standing. Women who crossed oceans following hopes and arrived on the other side into a silence they didn't expect. Women who learned to count the steps between the bedroom and the kitchen so as not to be an inconvenience. To those women I say, you are not the good china kept stored away for guests. You are the person who chose that china, who washed that china, who carried it around the world. Your presence is not a problem to be managed. Your love has no price condition, but your dignity does. Know the difference. And to the children who are reading, those who went far away, who built new lives, who sometimes look at their mother and see not a person, but a role, not a woman, but a function. I say this without anger and without judgment, because I understand that the world you inhabit is different, and that navigating between two cultures is difficult in ways that those who haven't lived it cannot imagine. Your mother existed before you. She had dreams you don't know, fears she never told you about, an entire life before you arrived and changed everything. She is not only a mother, she is a person who chose to be a mother, and that choice cost more than you will ever know. Don't hide her. Don't keep her in the back bedroom of your life. Don't treat her as a guest in the world she helped to build. You don't need to be perfect. You just need to be honest. The plane that brought me back to India crossed the Atlantic Ocean on a clear night, and I stood looking out the window at the darkness outside and thought about everything I had taken to Miami and everything I had brought back. The suitcases were the same. The wedding sari was still folded at the bottom. Suresh's photo was in the side pocket. The recipe notebook was intact. What I had left behind in Miami was the fear of taking up space, the belief that I needed to shrink to be accepted, the idea that my daughter's love depended on my invisibility. I left all of that there, and I came home.